Welcome everybody to our very first 2014 Leadership Development session. We've invited the CEO of the Climate Council, Australia's crowdsourced and crowd-funded body to provide public information around climate stuff, climate science and climate change. We're very pleased to have Amanda here, so thank you so much for joining us. Before we kick off, this is the first in our Leadership Development series to run through this year, and students in the Master of Energy Studies from the International Energy Centre will be covering a range of topics. The idea of today's session is to talk about the role of leadership and the critical role of leadership in the transition to a sustainable energy future. So without further ado, Amanda McKenzie, who is, as I said, CEO of the Climate Council, one of the co-founders of Australian Youth for Climate Change organisation, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, I should say, has previously been awarded the 2009 Environment Minister's Young Environmentalist of the Year and 2009 Rotary Young Achiever of the Year. A remarkable track record, a young leader in the field of sustainability, climate change and so on. So we're delighted to have you here. Amanda, thank you, welcome, please take it away.
No worries, thanks for having me. What I thought I'd do today is just give you a bit of a history, I suppose, of what I've been doing the last few years, and then some learnings that I've drawn from those experiences. So I wanted to start in a forest in Tasmania. You see the photo here, that's me right at the bottom, and that tree is about 75 metres tall in the Styx Valley right down south in southwest of Tasmania. And I had this interesting experience at the very start of 2006 where I'd taken Tim Flannery's book, The Weather Makers, on a trip to Tasmania. And I was in this beautiful ancient forest that had been there since before Europeans knew that Australia even existed. And then reading this story, Tim Flannery's book was all about how climate change was fundamentally altering the climate and was the impact of just a few generations of humans. So it was this sort of amazing juxtaposition of thinking about how the natural world had been supporting humanity for millions of years and thinking about how we could be quickly destroying it. So I went back to Melbourne where I was living at the time and thought, what can I do? I'm just one person. I'm a student at university at the time and I don't really know what to do. And I worried about it for a long time, for about 6 months. Until I met a woman called Helen Caldicott who was giving a speech about nuclear energy and climate change and a range of different sort of energy things. And I asked her, what should I do about climate change? I'm just one person. And she said, you should start a youth movement on climate change. I thought, that's kind of crazy. I don't know anything about starting a youth movement. I'm a law student. I'm wanting to be a human rights lawyer. Why are you asking me to do this? But I went home and thought about it and talked to my sister, and we started looking at social change movements and thinking about how young people had driven social change, whether it's in civil rights or anti-slavery movements or other things. So we thought we can do something small. Why don't we go out and start giving presentations in schools, in universities, in our sort of sphere of influence. So we put together a presentation and got together with others. This organisation morphed into what became the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. And what the presentations were about was drought, cyclones, impacts on the Great Barrier Reef, impacts on the polar regions, increased flooding, and increased impacts on developing nations. Of course, the irony of climate change is the people that will be worst affected are those who have the least input into the problem and least capacity to adapt to it. So we started this organisation called the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and its objective is to mobilise our generation to solve the climate crisis. So again, this is a few young people. We've been doing these presentations in schools and getting some interest. We had about 1,000 members by the end of 2007. But what we wanted to do was bring the organisation to the next step. We thought, what would it take for us to be having a real political impact? And we decided that 50,000 members was the number to start having a critical impact on the national debate. The plan to get 50,000 members was that we would first do a really big conference to bring together 1,500 young people, train them, get them energised, get them meeting other people that share their interests, and then unleash that 1,500 people onto Australia to mobilise another 50,000 people. So we started doing this in 2009, and the process of building PowerShift, which was our first conference, really started with building local groups all around Australia, and we were very keen to have a diverse movement. Our belief was that if we're going to have significant cultural change in Australia, it's got to come from everywhere. So throughout 2008, we built groups all around the country, and by 2009, we were able to bring together 1,500 people in, and this was in Western Sydney. And you see everyone with their green hard hats on in the audience. PowerShift, as I said, was about training people, having inspiring speakers come along and get people active and energised, but also about meeting people that care about it. I think one of the big challenges with social change is if you feel alone, it's very difficult to do anything. But if you're with a number of other people, you've got the social resource to do a lot more. We also then wanted to showcase our movement to the world, and this was in a dance on the steps of the Opera House. We got the crew from So You Think You Can Dance to train everyone that came to PowerShift, and I've got to tell you, this day would probably have been the most stressful day of my life, transporting 1,500 young people to the steps of the Opera House and asking them all to do a coordinated dance. But it was amazing. We got a huge amount of media attention, and it went viral on YouTube. We had hundreds of thousands of people watching it on YouTube, and the message of the dance was not just the doom and gloom, the things I mentioned earlier, the more extreme weather events, the coastal inundation, the other impacts of climate change that are so significant. This was about saying, hey, we can get together and create a positive future. We can create a renewable energy future with cleaner energy sources. We can build our cities to be more connected, to be better for all of us in terms of transport and health, etc. So this is about trying to show that this isn't just about what we can avoid, but what we can create together. And there's just another photograph of it. So the basic steps of PowerShift was 1, motivate and inspire people. 2, training and tools, getting people to buy into the mission of the organisation. 3, building connections, social structure for continuing people's engagement. A collective experience to deepen connections. People still talk about that dance on the steps of the Opera House as something that took them to the next level because it was so outside their comfort zone. To be dancing in public with a green hard hat on with 1,000 other people. But the step 5 was about meaningful future involvement. And for us, we thought about how can we, as a very small organisation at that time, how can we mobilise the maximum number of people? And it was really through decentralised organising. So creating an event that was going to be inspiring and interesting, but can be taken on in a whole lot of different ways. So this was called Youth Decide, a national youth vote on climate change. So I've just got a couple of pictures from our Melbourne events. Basically, the idea was that it was going to be a youth vote on climate change, and you could vote online, you could vote in events, and we encouraged young people who'd been to PowerShift to organise events in their community. So it could just be the local library, it could be at the school canteen, it could be a whole student event, as some people did, it could be a human sign in Ballarat, or various other things. So that's been one of the, I'll show you a couple of pictures from that. So this is just a voting line down in Melbourne for an event, and on Flinders Street Station, which you might recognise. This was a flash mob in Flinders Street Station, so commuters were sort of confronted with lots of young people inviting them to get involved and to vote, and then doing this crazy dance. We also did a concert at Federation Square, which was roughly 5,000 people. This is a snapshot of one place, but this was happening all around the country. There was 300 events, I mentioned, organised by roughly sort of 1,800 people. Online, it involved about 40,000 young people voting and participating in events. So this was the fuel, this vote, which enabled us to grow our organisation in the end to over 50,000 members, and that allowed us to then knock on the doors of politicians, knock on the doors of business leaders, the key influencers in society, and say, hey, we're an influential voice here and we think we can make a difference. So that was, so that's sort of Youth Decide and where we got to then. The AOCC is now over 100,000 members. I think it's about 120,000 members, young people all around the country that are concerned about this issue and want to put their action where their values are, I suppose. To give you a sense of some of the other activities that we did as the AOCC, I think young people have a moral impact on a debate, because particularly around this, which is a future issue, because they're saying, sorry, just one moment. Katrina, I'm just doing a speech. Sorry. That's okay. Sorry, there's new internet technologies where you can do a speech anywhere. Anyway, I was just saying that the AOCC, one of the things we tried to do was to have a moral message always about young people are the people that are going to experience the consequences of climate change, and let's put that right in front of all of the right in front of the politicians or any leaders. And one way we did that was a campaign during the 2010 election called the Climate Elephant. So, you know, we were out there trying to put press releases on climate change. We were trying to do other actions. We were trying to have meetings with politicians before the election, and everyone kept ignoring us, basically. Climate change wasn't on the agenda in the 2010 election. So we did the only thing that, you know, a logical youth organisation could do, and hire every elephant suit in Australia, which was only 8 at that time. There are more now because we've made them. So this elephant chased Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott all around the country with volunteers within the suit. So here's a picture of the elephant meeting Julia Gillard. This is a particularly fun day because Julia Gillard was giving a speech where she had a big window behind her with a sort of green vista. And she's giving a speech to the national media about whatever the agenda of the day was. And the elephants came up and started to jump outside the window with this sign like, "The elephant in the room is climate change, reduce pollution now." And the national media went from looking at the Prime Minister of the day to looking at the elephant. And the elephant became the news story, and the elephant became the one that was interviewed, and climate change then made it onto the national media during the election campaign. The elephant followed both of them, as I mentioned, around. This is sort of a spot the elephant slide. You can see Tony Abbott there, and there you can see the elephant. He made lots of friends around the country. This is one of the many events around the country he did with AOCC, and you can see the elephant in the middle. As I mentioned, he met lots of journalists and got a huge amount of media coverage. The media coverage slide doesn't seem to be coming up. Anyway, the next thing that the elephant did was, here we go. Here's the media coverage. So you can see there was lots of coverage all around the country, and it was one of the vehicles during that 2010 election to put pressure around climate change on during the election, which inevitably, once the election had finished and then there was an agreement between the Greens and the Labor Party, my belief is that this pressure that happened during the election was critical to then the Labor Party wanting to do more action on climate change, as well as the pressure from the Greens. The slide seems to have got a bit out. Oh, there it is. So we then met Julia Gillard on election day, and the elephant gave her a hug, and she tweeted us that if we had a standing invitation to meet with her once, if she was elected. Of course, she was elected, and we then put pressure on her to meet us. So it was sort of 3 months after the election, and we'd been talking to her office to no avail to get this meeting. And this is one of the examples that I think shows the power of young people and new technology, because we then decided, okay, well, we'll do a quick Twitter campaign. We'll email 10,000 of our members and ask them to post on Twitter asking her to meet with us. So within an hour, there's 800 tweets on her page saying, hey, Julia Gillard, please meet with the climate elephant. The media then starts calling me saying, where is the climate elephant? How is he mobilising people? What's he up to? And Julia, being very interested in it, and then some media articles started to flow on from that. Then another hour goes by and we've got another sort of 800 or 900 tweets, and Julia Gillard office rings us and says, let's organise a meeting, let's lock it in for next month. So that really interesting thing of young people being able to quickly, and young people of all ages, not just of voting age, but also not of voting age, being able to have a direct conversation with the Prime Minister over the internet and getting an outcome very rapidly. So Gillard agreed to meet the climate elephant. So the AOCC for me was a way of, as a young person, having an impact on climate change and creating a vehicle where I felt like there wasn't something that I tried to get involved in a whole lot of different organisations, but I hadn't found that there was something that I could really kind of get my teeth into and feel like I was really making a difference. So the AOCC was about creating something where I felt like I was making a difference and I could create opportunities for other young people to feel like they were making a difference. But by the end of 2010, I decided to leave the AOCC and I moved on to the Climate Commission, which at that time was just starting. The Climate Commission was led by Tim Flannery, who you probably are aware of, former Australian of the Year. And the Climate Commission's job, it was set up by the Gillard government, was to provide accurate, authoritative information to the Australian public on climate change. And the work that the Commission did was, number one, travel around Australia and do public meetings, talking to Australians about climate change and the impact it would have in their local region. Secondly, it was about putting out national and local reports on climate change, so from climate change and health to something like what's happening in Queensland, what's happening in the Great Barrier Reef, all those sort of topics made up different reports for the Climate Commission. And the idea was to take this complex science, which is often very hard for the average person to understand, distill it and make it accessible and communicatable, if that's a word, to the Australian public. We had a lot of success with this. By 2012, we were having huge coverage. You measure media coverage usually in ad dollars. So if you were going to buy the advertising at the same amount, what would it have cost? So the media coverage that we were receiving through 2012 was about $12 million worth of positive coverage for climate change. Now that's about 10 times the average sort of climate change organisation that's out there. So you can see that we were making a real impact on the public narrative around climate change. We also thought about who are the key influences in this space, because it can't just be a discussion between environmentalists, politicians and a few other players. Who else can we bring in? And we decided that health services and emergency services were key to this discussion. So we, particularly through 2013, but also through 2012, we met with emergency services workers all around Australia, did lots of speeches to them. So because I suppose there's a number of reasons. One is that they're really trusted amongst Australians, but also because they obviously have a huge role to play in addressing climate change impacts as they occur, and it's crucial that those people are prepared for what's going to happen into the future. So we also did that sort of key influencer work, as we called it. So the Commission, I mentioned the reports. This is just one that I thought might be relevant. You might remember at the end of last year, this time last year, the summer had been pretty intense. We'd had 100 at that time. Later on, when they did a bigger assessment of this, it's actually far more records broken around Australia. So we had our hottest summer, we had our hottest day on average right around Australia, we had our hottest January, and lots of places broke records. You see, up in Queensland, there was quite a lot of flood and rainfall records, whereas most of the rest of the country was experiencing intense temperature records. There was 7 days in a row in early January, you might remember, where there was 7 days in a row of over 30 degrees on average for Australia as a whole, which was pretty crazy. So this is just an example of how we try to distill all of this complexity around temperature and rainfall and extreme weather and climate change and distill it into some quite an easy to digest graphic, which then could be distributed. So this type of thing was shared about 30,000 times online on Facebook, which gave it an audience of about 2 million people. So as you know, with the Climate Commission, and was mentioned in the introduction, we knew that the Abbott government would disband the Climate Commission before the election, but after the election had occurred, we were surprised that actually the first act of the Abbott government was to dismiss the Climate Commission. And we thought, we feel like we've been doing really valuable work. We're feeling we're getting more traction than most of the other climate change groups out there. We're really being able to connect with people, not just the ABC audience or the Fairfax audience, which often is a bit more educated on the climate change issues, but we're connecting to Sunrise and Today and the commercial TV news, and we're touching the audience that really needs to hear this information and really needs some accurate information put in front of them. So we thought, well, maybe we can keep going. So we were sacked, I think it was sort of late September, and 5 days later we relaunched as the Climate Council. And it was really stepping out on a limb. We didn't know whether the public would have noticed that we'd been dismissed and would be really interested in whether we'd come back. But we had got a lot of telephone calls and tweets and emails saying, look, we really appreciate what you did, and we're disappointed that this has happened. So we stepped out on a limb, and what happened was that it was released on Lateline on it was the Monday night, and tweets started going about, what is this Climate Council thing, what's going on? And at 12:01 we put up the website, and the first donor was James from WA at 12:01 for $15. So that kicked it off, and by 6 a.m. we were raising about $1,000 an hour to get the Climate Council back in business. I think this is great. And then by the time we did the press conference, it had already escalated to $30,000 an hour that we were raising to put the Climate Council back in business. We did the press conference, and by the end of the day we'd raised $500,000 from roughly sort of 7,000 or 8,000 people. By the end of the week, 15,000 people had donated roughly $85 each to put us back in business, raising over $1 million. This is an amazing example of crowdfunding. The biggest crowdfunding campaign is actually our campaign that we ran. The second biggest is for a video game. So it's an amazing, I think it's an amazing accolade that Australia has, but the biggest crowdfunding campaign we have at this stage was to put science in front of the public. And I'm really proud of that. This article is just from The Australian with the support of the Climate Council taking off. It was an interesting time because most organisations, not-for-profits that are raising money through direct contact in the street, or they've got a really big email list, or they've got these sorts of things. Not many organisations raise money directly through Facebook, and over 50% of our donors came through Facebook, whereas another 15% came through Twitter. So it was a really interesting illustration of the impact of a huge media story and how that translates to people interacting on Facebook and Twitter, and then the result of being able to raise such a significant amount of money. So that was roughly to give you a sense of how much that was in comparison to the Climate Commission. The Climate Commission had a budget of $1.6 million a year, and that didn't include the support that the Department of Climate Change gave. So things like website support or design or operational support and things like that. So what we've done in setting up the Climate Council is pare it back and think about, so we're a more lean operation, I suppose, but also we want to be able to have as much or more of the impact that the Climate Commission was able to have. So this just is a couple of graphics that we shared on Facebook that give you a sense of what we were sharing at that time. That was early in the morning when we'd raised about $160,000, and then in 3 days we'd raised out $800, as I said. This was by a graphic that we shared after, I think it was a week and a half, just over a week. So we'd amassed 63,000 Facebook friends, 7,000 Twitter followers. We'd had hundreds of media articles, and we released 2 short reports because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put out a report right after we launched, and we wanted to demonstrate to the public exactly what we were going to do. So we distilled that for the public. It also was the hottest September on record, so we put out a report on that too. So as I mentioned, 20,000 founding friends raising over $1 million. So we were really pleased with that, but then it's been the journey since then of establishing an organisation and trying to have an impact. So since that time we've put out 7 reports, including a comprehensive report on bushfires and climate change. What we know in the last 30 years that bushfire risk has increased all over the southeast of Australia, which includes some of the biggest population centres like Canberra and Melbourne. We also just put out yesterday a report on heat waves and climate change, which looks at all of a comprehensive assessment of all the research on heat waves in Australia, and it finds that heat waves are increasing in frequency, they're getting hotter, and they're occurring more often. And this is true right around Australia. It's getting hotter. The hot days in Australia have doubled in just the last 50 years. So this is the information that we're trying to bring to the public. So I wanted to just talk about 3 lessons that I've learned through my personal experience of these organisations and working in the climate change area. The first is to get out of your own way. I was once told by a neuropsychologist that our brains are like filing cabinets. The things that we think about the most come to the front, and the things that we think about the least go to the back. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but that happens in my experience. And I think that often the I can't do, this is impossible, I'm no good at this, I'm not as good as the other person, are the tabs in the filing cabinet that sometimes come to the front. The ones that are, I can do it, I'm confident in myself, I've done some really good stuff lately, those ones we tend to discount and put towards the back. So I think that confidence is often the thing that gets most in our way, and our own negativity towards ourselves, rather than other people's judgment of us. It's our judgment of ourselves that stops us. So I think that the first lesson in leadership is to get out of our own way. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be self-reflective and shouldn't try to improve ourselves, or that we should have false confidence, but we should have confidence in who we are and self-belief. The second point is to never underestimate your own agency. I mentioned that when I started my journey acting on climate change, I felt like there was nothing I could do. And I certainly feel like that at times all through this period. And, you know, we haven't solved the climate crisis yet. We haven't got adequate government policy here. We haven't, as a globe, worked out how we're going to deal with it. But, you know, that's not necessarily... but I suppose for myself, I think that particularly when I was younger, I'd take that whole challenge onto my own shoulders and think, oh no, I can't solve the whole problem, so is it really worth acting on it all? But I think that once you start trying to have an impact follows you. And one of the things that happened from the Climate Council is that we stepped out and we took a big risk and we asked people to join us. And in my experience, when you step out and take a big risk and you have a good plan and a plan that people can believe in, and you believe in it yourself, that's when people join you. I also mentioned the Twitter example and the climate elephant. That I like that example because we have more technology now in our pocket with our iPhones or our laptops than we had when we sent a rocket to the moon as humanity. So each of us is this technological powerhouse, and we use it every day to connect to our friends and as toys to essentially play on. But if we were able to use these technologies as more to organise ourselves and to create positive social change, huge things can happen. And we saw that in Egypt and in other countries recently in terms of some of the revolutions there and the power of Twitter and other communication technology. The third point is to share and steal. I think that the internet is one example of how we're more collaborative now or businesses are more collaborative now than they were in the past, and I think that's true of NGOs. I'm often struck by what I perceive as being a bit of a generational gap in the NGO space, where NGOs that older NGOs or more established NGOs tend to be less collaborative than new scrappy operations. And the new scrappy organisations do a lot of sharing, and these are often organisations that are internet-based, like a GetUp or a Some of Us or a Vars, which are working globally. And I think that that's got a huge power when you know that people are working for good together to share and all collectively improve. I say steal as well because I think that one of the great things we have is access to a huge amount of knowledge all of the time about what's going on around the world. So something like the concept of Youth Decide that I mentioned, which was a decentralised campaign, we had adapted a campaign that we'd seen in the US done by 350 and then put our own ideas on it and, you know, went out there. The climate elephant, I remember watching The West Wing, and they had a scene where they had a chicken chasing the president, and that's where I got the climate elephant idea, from that chicken. So I think that it's important to be looking out there at what works and then taking it and adapting it and making it your own. So it's not really stealing. It just makes it stand out a bit more. And just to end, I wanted to tell you a bit of a story. If you can take your minds out of the room that you're in and take yourselves over to Africa, to Kenya. It's nighttime, the forest is dark and all of the animals are sleeping. there's a sudden storm and lightning strikes and hits the tree, and the tree bursts into flames. The fire starts to consume other trees around it and bushes, and gradually starts to consume a significant part of the forest. The animals all run to a nearby hill, watching as the fire consumes their homes. They're petrified, they're paralysed by watching this fire. And they say to each other, what can we do? They hear a buzzing noise straight past their ear, and they look, and there's the hummingbird, the smallest animal of all. And the hummingbird flies down to the river, picks up a drop of water and takes it to the fire. And he comes back and forth, back and forth. The elephant, the largest animal, says to the hummingbird, what are you doing? How can you possibly make a difference? The hummingbird stops just briefly and says, I'm doing the best that I can, and continues, river to the fire, river to the fire. The monkeys are inspired by this and take some huge banana leaves and get water from the river and throw it on the fire. The rhinoceroses go and start stamping on the fire to put it out. And eventually even the elephant takes a huge gulp of water into its long trunk and sprays the fire to finally put it out. I like this story because I feel that anyone can be a hummingbird. It's just a question of getting started, and I think there's a lesson in that story for all of us. Thank you very much for that, and Sebastian, we can do questions now if you like.
Amanda, thank you. That was wonderful. What I'm going to suggest, it's a pity you're not in the room. That would be great. And this technology has its challenges. We've had some freezes. I think sometimes when we use the webcams, especially, it can slow stuff down. But I think a big part of this for us as well was being able to see the animation in your face, and that was a really valuable part of the talk as well. What I'm going to suggest for questions is that people type them. And put them into the chat box, so that if you have a look on the right there somewhere, you should be able to see that that chat box. So if anybody would like to ask questions, why don't you just type them into the chat box, and we'll see if Amanda can see them that way. Here we go. Amanda, just while some questions are coming through, one of our guys is in the room here who would like to ask you a verbal question. Okay. This is Okuchi, who is a Nigerian Australian. Please, there you go.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks for your presentation. It was very impressive. I just wanted to ask you, do you work collaboratively with other political parties or with the government towards developing policies that reflect a consciousness of the reality of climate change and the urgency to act, or do you find it more appropriate to act independently?
I see our role as trying to create the cultural conditions under which we get good policy. I think whichever party is in power, you need to have the appropriate level of public concern and public outcry to get outcomes. So whether it's Labor or Liberal, they have to feel the pressure. So our work is predominantly about media work and helping to shift the public narrative and supplying the resources to the organisations out there that are doing the grassroots work of having those day-to-day conversations. That said, we also do brief politicians very regularly on the work that we're doing, particularly the most recent bushfire report, because it was the most comprehensive assessment of bushfires and climate change in Australia. We've done a range of meetings with politicians of all sides to make sure that there is strong awareness of what's going on. One of the interesting things when you look at public opinion polling on climate change is that people are highly influenced by their political persuasions. And this is largely true on a lot of issues that are highly complex. So people look to whichever side of politics they tend to vote for and just go, oh, if they're landing on that, I'll land on that too. So there is a real role in educating politicians, not just from the policy perspective, but also because I think that they have a real role in leadership on the issue and changing opinions.
Amanda, can I ask just before you, while you're reading some of these long ones that are going to come through, further to that, we've had some conversations about how critical psychology is in the whole climate change discourse. And, you know, the utility of powerful, simple, and yet comprehensive information, like the graphic, the Angry Summer graphic, which our Director of Education here used in our Friday night introductory dinner. So we use that when we teach courses. We take those sorts of things and use those as part of our teaching materials very much. So it's not just stuff that gets shared on Facebook. This, you know, that sort of thing is very powerful, and we use that with students. But I guess my question is, when your co-founder of the AYCC, Anna Rose, did that wonderful television program with Nick Minchin, where the two of them travelled around. You know, she was trying to persuade him about certain things. You have to engage with people and, as you've said, politicians with deep-seated beliefs about things. You know, people talk about climate change almost in religious terms. It's, do you believe it or not? It's not so much about facts and science. I guess my question is, how do you approach that psychological question? How do you approach someone, you know, who has opinions which are beliefs rather than views that can be changed, and what's the attitude or the strategy to work with those sorts of different views?
It's a really relevant question, and it's one of those things that's been debated enormously amongst those communicating the issue. The first thing I'd say is that we don't need everyone to agree to get change. There are still people that believe the Earth is flat. There's still people that believe that gravity is not a real concept, but we're not trying to change them. We're just getting on with, you know, the world is round and let's get on with it. I think climate change will be the same. There'll always be a group of people that are not willing to change their views because it's primarily as a consequence of belief, and there's no evidence that can change them. I remember Nick Minchin saying, when he was asked what evidence would change your mind, and Nick Minchin said none, which implies that he's obviously not taking it from a scientific perspective, because scientists would always say evidence-based research would change my mind, and they'd always be open to changing their mind if there was the relevant evidence available. That said, and another point I should make, is that people often perceive that scepticism is about half the population in Australia. So a skeptic is someone that doesn't believe climate change is happening or thinks that humans play no role in it. Research by the CSIRO shows that only 7% of people actually hold that view. About 40% of people think it's happening and it's caused by humans. And there's another group of people that think that it's happening and that humans play a role, but they're not sure of how significant that role is. So I believe that there's a couple of things that need to be done. One is that there's a huge amount of people that are concerned about it, that get the problem, that get what we need to do, that need to be mobilised and energised and to be given a role in solving the problem. I think that there's another role, and part of the role for that group is to reach out to the other group that are saying, oh, well, how concerned should I really be, and is this a big issue for me? And I think that social change movements usually come from that group of people that have adopted it early, get the problem, going out and mobilising the people around them. It's not generally just through some public figures talking to people on the other end of the spectrum. So my view is that there needs to be quite a lot of work done to mobilise people. You might remember in 2008, 2009, the public discourse on climate change was quite different, and that was partly because we hadn't had this very toxic debate around a carbon tax, but also that we had a huge amount of people that were willing to talk about it in a barbecue and in the schoolyard. It's become so negative now that I think people feel reluctant to talk about it in their locality because they're frightened that people don't agree with them, when in fact the CSIRO research suggests that people actually, most of us do agree. We want something done about it, we're concerned about it, and we think it will become a greater and greater issue into the future. So that's some of my thoughts on that issue. Should I now go to an internet, a chat question?
Okay, great. Please,
Can everyone
please do.
see the
Please do.
question from Kieran? So Kieran asks about social. Okay,
Yes,
great.
we can.
Kieran's obviously asking about social change movements tending to fizzle out, and 2012 is a good example. With the climate change issue, okay, and the retweeting. Well, the first thing I'd say is that I think that participating on social media is part of real change. I think that it's obviously very easy to click a like or to share something or to, click a petition. But these things are all part of creating a culture in which we're discussing the issue and it's highlighted. Climate change requires action on a grassroots level, but predominantly it requires action on the national level. We need to fundamentally shift our energy systems, our agriculture, our buildings. These types of things have to be done by government. And as I said earlier, they're only going to be done when there's adequate public pressure. In my view, that requires social movements. It requires when polling is done in Western Sydney that people say climate change is a concern. It requires an ongoing pressure from the public that this is a genuine concern. And I think that happens partly through communication, through people sharing on Facebook and on Twitter and saying to their friends, hey, I'm concerned about this, are you? The next level of that is to then directly communicate to politicians, business leaders. Business leaders are important too. Like, we're all consumers, we all can have an influence on what companies are doing around us. And government is not just the federal government, but state and local government have an impact on this as well. So I think that the sharing is important and part of the national conversation and is heard by politicians when there's a whole lot of talk in one area. But obviously it's also important if people take the next step too. But I don't think we should necessarily just discount what's sometimes called clicktivism. I think it is actually valuable. I think the issue about fizzling out, though, is really important. Social movements tend to ebb and flow in terms of, or any issue tends to ebb and flow in terms of how important it is at a particular time. In 2007, 2008, climate change was on the ascendancy, but we hadn't actually talked really about how we were going to deal with it as a society. It became a negative issue when it got focused on cost of living. What is this actually going to cost me, and do I really want to pay it? And obviously, the opposition at the time, now the Abbott government, argued that the cost of living impact was too high and we shouldn't be paying to address the issue. And as a consequence, climate change went down as an issue. But it was also because people stopped talking about why the issue mattered. The environment movement, I think, thought they won the issue back in sort of 2008, and everyone stopped talking about why climate change matters and started talking about the policy solutions. It was the CPRS and then later the carbon tax. So I think that it's important to consistently be talking about why climate change matters and localising it for people, making it relevant for people, and continuing to do that. But there will be an ebb and flow over time. It's about how do we accelerate that concern again. We call this decade the critical decade for action, because if we're really going to deal with the problem, it has to be this decade. So we're working on how do you create another upswell in public opinion to create the sort of political action that we saw in sort of 2007 when people were most concerned.
That's great, Amanda. Thank you. We have another question here from the local room.
Hi, Amanda. I'm Syed, and really nice to have you here. I have a couple of questions. The first one is that what's your opinion when it comes to the adverse effects of when we take climate change measures? It will usually adversely affect the industrial and economic growth. So what's your opinion on that? How that is to be handled? And the other thing is that we met a coal executive yesterday. So the impression that I got from there was that there are countries such as China and India which have really large energy needs right now. and the energy demand is going to be there for the next 10 years at least. And we don't see, we might see a decrease in growth of coal use, but the growth will be there and to a very large extent. So where are we going with the climate change then?
Yeah, they're very important questions. In terms of the first question, we need to work out a way of tackling climate change as well as continuing to prosper as a nation. One thing that's been really interesting, if you look at the emissions data over the last few years, is that we were growing very strongly, but it started to level off, and over the last 6 months, it's actually started to decline not very much, but by a little bit. So, but at the same time, our economic growth has continued. So there's not necessarily a correlation between greater energy use and greater economic growth. We need to shift that paradigm in our own minds and say, how do we get continued economic growth but level off our emissions? Because the reality is, if we don't deal with the problem, there are going to be very, very significant economic costs. And we just have to look at the extreme weather over the last summer. So, for instance, we've seen the bushfires in, the Blue Mountains, for instance, bushfires now in Victoria. We've also seen the heat waves with their impact on infrastructure and productivity. So there's real economic impacts to seeing increasing extreme weather as well as coastal inundation and the other issues surrounding climate change. So we've got this real economic cost coming and already being felt from climate change. And then we've got to ask the question about the cost of shifting our economy to something else. So I think that the question often gets asked, what does it cost to deal with climate change, and doesn't get asked, but doesn't factor in, the real cost of climate change that are here and are coming over time. So there's some important economic questions for us, but now a number of countries are already levelling off their emissions growth and still growing economically. So those countries are the ones that we should be looking to. But also we've done a good job. The policy suite that we currently have has worked to reduce emissions and to continue us growing at the same time. The second question was about coal. I think the coal industry often oversells its potential, in my view. You look at groups like Nicola Stern's group over in the UK has done an assessment called the carbon bubble. So it looks at the carbon budget. So how much can we emit from now to 2050 and still stay below 2 degrees of warming? So 2 degrees is considered the threshold that should not be crossed because it would be so severe. Nicola Stern has suggested that would mean the impact would be greater than the Great Depression and World War II combined. That's a huge economic impact. So we shouldn't get to 2 degrees. That then looks at a carbon budget. How much can we emit till then? What we know from that carbon budget analysis, which has now been endorsed by the World Bank, by HSBC and other big financial institutions, is that 80% of the fossil fuels
Hello, Amanda, are you still with us? You seem to have frozen or disappeared. You're back. Amanda, we seem to have lost your sound. I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you just click your microphone?
And
There you go. Okay, you're back.
can you hear
Sorry,
me
you
now?
were talking. Yes, that's much better. That's much better.
Did you hear me talk about climate China? Or
Yes. Yeah. I think that
okay,
answers.
great.
Before Quentin's asked you the online question there, but I want to invite one of our students who's in the room here, who's Shabina, who's from Malaysia. She has a question to ask you, so I'll put her on.
Hello, Amanda.
Hello.
It's great to have you here. It's just a very general question. In your story, you talk about the hummingbird role as in making changes. What do you think the changes that we as a public can do, that we can act on to make a difference in the climate change? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. I think there are a number of things that individuals can do. You can make a difference in your own life through reducing your energy consumption, whether it's electricity or whether it's the way that you transport yourself. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of individual action like that because I think it's often really challenging. I don't know where you live, but where I live, it's often really difficult to get public transport to where I need to go, and it's not always practical. And I think that actually puts people off the change, the overarching changes that we need to make. We need to make changes to public transport, for instance, at a government level, so it's practical for everyone, so it's not a deterrent to being sustainable. That said, there is value in participating in making changes where they're practical. The second thing is I think it's all about communication. I think it's about sharing the information with your friends and family, having the conversation with them, as well as having the conversation with those that represent you. Whether it's local, state or federal government, I think it's crucial that all of us play our role as citizens and communicate to them about what we're concerned about. And I think that's where the change will eventually come from. I might just take Quentin's... Okay. Have our actions had an international range? And are we working with other countries, with organisations such as ours? We certainly have an aspiration to work internationally. Tim Flannery and Will Steffen, who are both scientists on the council, have already done quite a bit of work overseas. We've talked to officials in China, in the US, in India, about setting up similar organisations in those countries. They also have the similar challenge of needing to bring the public along to understanding what is the problem and what is the solution. We've also just done a range of different speeches. I was in Brunei last year doing speeches to their National Environment Conference about, you'd know that Brunei is on Borneo with this huge, beautiful old rainforest that is holding an enormous amount of carbon. There's a real pressure in Borneo to cut down those forests for palm oil. That's got a significant impact on the climate because when you cut down forests, a huge amount of carbon goes into the atmosphere as that wood and other material rots. So I went to the Brunei conference, for instance, to talk about conservation in forests as a way of dealing with climate change. So we are trying to have an international impact, and I think particularly once with some of the graphics that we're producing, when we
Amanda,
do
could
ones that are
we
more
ask
relevant
you
internationally,
one more question from the room here? We've taken a
just
lot of
the
your
launch
time
of the
today. It's
council
been
got quite a bit of
brilliant.
international
I've got Tom,
press, so we're hoping that there's
has one more
interest
question
over
for
time.
you.
Hi, Amanda, and thanks for a wonderful talk. My question is, you mentioned 50,000 people in your group and kind of the block of power that gives you to speak to politicians. But how does that compare to the resources and the block of power that, let's say, the fossil fuel lobby has? How does that compare?
Yeah, well, the fossil fuel industry obviously has long-term connections into political parties, and there's a whole lot that's been written internationally about the impact of the fossil fuel industry and particularly in financing the denial of climate change. So in some ways, you know, the community is not going to be able to necessarily mobilise the same monetary resources, and you saw the mining industry, for instance, do the mining campaign, advertising campaign, I suppose it was a couple of years ago now, 2010 or 2011, because they didn't like the mining tax, and that had a big impact on the politicians. That said, I think that whenever you're getting a significant social change, and you just have to think back to an issue like slavery, where there was clear economic vested interest in the status quo of keeping people enslaved, and people on the other side arguing we shouldn't have slavery anymore, and creating a new economic case for how we can exist in a more positive way without slavery. And this was an ongoing competition. Vested interest slave owners were financing the the pro-slavery movement. And there's significant parallels to now. But what happens there is that people power can outweigh vested interests, because, you know, there's the truth on your side, and there's the interest in the future of humanity on the side of action on climate change or on anti-slavery, for instance. So I think that although vested interests are enormously powerful, we just have to look at the influence that has, or the change in attitude globally around climate change. Back in 2005, no one really knew about climate change. Today, everyone knows about it, and there's an ongoing public discussion in just about every country about what their action should be. So things have changed significantly, and that's been against the wishes of the significant vested interest.
Amanda,
so
that's great.
my view is, I think,
interestingly, I
it's
think
just
as one of
whether
the students
we
mentioned last night,
can do it in time to
we had a
protect
discussion,
not just Australia, but people
discussion
around the
function
world.
with a senior member of the fossil fuel industry, and I asked him the question in terms of what the climate science says about, you know, potential disasters and extreme impacts. What are your thoughts on that? And he said very specifically that we have to address public opinion. So his comment was not straight to the science. His comment was that in 2007 at the election, public opinion around climate change issues was a huge driver, and therefore business needed to respond to that. So it's very interesting what you say. I'm just going to turn our camera on very quickly. Huge drive. So it comes up. So I'm going to finish this up there, I suppose. We are so grateful for your time today. It's been an excellent session. Your comments, your ideas, the experience first, but also the very clear and simple messages about what leadership can mean and how you can develop it, I think are incredibly important. So thank you so much for your contribution to the Master of Energy Studies Leadership Program. We will hope to be in contact with you again, and I will certainly follow up in writing to thank you again. But can the students that are in the room please express their thanks to Amanda? We're very, very grateful for your time, and we will look forward to seeing you again.